Nice view, isn't it? A real tidy little valley. There was fear in that valley once. Wally Bartlett, the storekeeper, knows more about it than anyone else. Let's go down and see him.
We think our town is a little unusual. Might look like any other county seat if you're just passing through, but ours is one of the first places where the people in town really got down and worked with the people in the country to solve a problem that affected both of them. Wally Bartlett's hardware store is a natural meeting place. Everybody likes him, farmers as well as the people in town. I guess it's because he's always interested in anything that will help the community.
Hello, Wally, in? Oh, Merle, come on in. Good to see you.
Oh, just fine. Wally, I wonder if you could take time to tell the folks just what a headache it used to be every time a black cloud appeared over the ridge.
Well, I spent 20 years trying to get rid of it. I guess I can take a few minutes to talk about it. Won't you sit down?
Thank you.
Well, the main trouble was that we never knew what Miller's Creek and the upper Skewing River were going to do during a heavy rain or a spring thaw. Normally, they looked innocent enough, especially in the upper part of the county near the headwaters. But just the same, it didn't take much to put those streams over their banks, particularly where they came together in the bottomland over on the other side of town. I know because I live there. I went through my first flood back in the 30s, and 6 times since then, floodwaters have been over the streets in our town. I figured there must be some way to prevent this, or at least to cut down on the number of floods and the amount of damage to our homes and businesses. So I went to see Merle here. He's our local soil conservation service man.
That's right. Wally had more questions than I could answer when we first talked about it.
I sure did. And I found out at the library that too much or too little had always been the story of water on this earth. That where people have settled, a balance between land and water seems to have been upset, and this has to be restored. By the time I had checked back issues at the newspaper office, I was convinced that there wasn't anyone anywhere this side of hunger and thirst, light and power and taxes that wasn't affected somehow by the way water flowed off the land. At first, as I pieced the picture together, it didn't make me feel any better. More than half the damage over the United States by floods, most of us never hear about. Floods that take place on the little streams up the valley. About 50 million acres subject to overflow above the location of any major flood control improvements on larger streams. And year after year, all this draining away the strength of the land. Floods along tributaries and creeks all over the country, clogging water courses, filling up drainage ditches, washing away the wealth of the farms. Soil carried off to town where it isn't wanted. Lost soil taking away everybody's bread and butter. I don't know how many acres this means out of place at the bottom of the river. More plant nourishment than we're putting back into the soil. Millions of dollars down the creek. And most of it unnecessary. Statistics showed that it's economically feasible to prevent much of the damage from floods along creeks. and that the benefits of a complete watershed program could, in some instances, amount to 3 times the cost. Of course, even in the early days, some farmers were taking conservation measures to stop the damage on individual farms. They were learning the significance of the fact that too much rainwater runs off the surface with no respect for property boundaries, in many instances carrying with it their greatest asset, the soil. But I couldn't convince any of my neighbors in town that this had anything to do with them. It took the flood of '48 to make folks around here realize this. That was the biggest flood we'd ever had. Oh, it didn't make any nationwide headlines. It's usually only the ones on the main streams and rivers that do. But this last one sure upset the lives of a lot of people in our valley.
Half my field's on your place.
Well, it's about as much as I lost below me, only it's in the wrong place. Hello, Hart. Hello, Kerm.
Looks like most of our soil's down here on your place.
Well, there's a lot of it comes down here, and it's yours. You can have it. Hope the folks in town don't have to go anywhere for a while. If this keeps up, it won't be long before there's more silt than water in this reservoir.
A lot of people were yelling for something to be done. So City Council dredged out the upper skewing. This would run the water out of the bottomland faster, but actually it merely shifted the problem further downstream, making more trouble for the communities below us. It seemed to Merle and me that people needed more education. Remember, Merle, how you talked with the farmers of the Soil Conservation District and their neighborhood groups?
While you were ringing doorbells all over town?
The outcome was a citizens committee representing both farmers and the people in town. In the beginning, they weren't too sure what they could accomplish beyond studying the situation and gaining general support in the community for some kind of action to prevent another flood.
And that's the problem which has brought us here. First, we've got to understand just what a watershed is. This simply means all the land which sheds its surplus water into a given lake, stream, or river. It may be any size, from a few hundred acres to the whole Mississippi basin, which sheds the water of 2/3 of the continent. But a watershed is more than a piece of geography. It includes farmlands, grazing lands, forest lands, even some wild lands, towns, railroads, highways, cities and factories, and mines and everything that we build on it. Our people, our agriculture, and our industry depend upon water. You might say the very life of our town depends on it. What happens anywhere on a watershed affects everyone who lives on it, whether in the country or in town. Everything that happens on a watershed depends on the land and the water. There's a double aspect to the problem. On the one hand, water supply, on the other, water damage. Which aspect is more important to a community depends on where the watershed is. Our problem is mainly one of water damage. In the West, it's mainly a problem of water supply. But the basic elements of the job to be done are the same, to get the right amount of water where we need it, when we need it. Now, when water in any form hits the earth, 3 things happen to it. Some soaks in, replenishing underground water supplies, perhaps emerging in springs which feed streams. Some evaporates, or is used by vegetation. Some rolls off down the slopes, sometimes accumulating in quantities large enough to cause a flood. We've got to try to control every raindrop, from the time it hits the ridge, proceeding down the slopes, across fields, lawns, and parks, through swamps and forests, through small field drainage ways and creeks, until it reaches the mainstream or river.
How do we do it?
It requires a program for treating the watershed as a whole, taking into account each patch of land, the plants, animals, and people living on it, each rivulet, stream, and pond, each man-made structure, and every activity of the entire area. The way to save our soil, protect our water supply, and reduce upstream damage from floods and siltation is to get as much of the rain and snowmelt as possible into the ground and route the rest of the water safely through the overflow areas. The ground is the greatest reservoir of all, with more natural storage than all the man-made structures we could ever build. But even this great reservoir can fill and overflow after long periods of rain or extended snowmelt. The trees and grasses increase the rate of infiltration into the soil and slow up the movement of the water across the ground. Strip cropping will intercept the water as it starts to move down the slope before it runs across the crops. Terracing, contouring, and deep plowing will let the water get into the subsoil. Deep-rooted plants create channels and pockets, and farm ponds can catch the small flows.
We've recognized that all along in the program of our Soil Conservation District.
Sure, but we must realize the big advantage in applying the Soil Conservation District approach to a whole watershed when this is possible. We must get the townspeople and the farm people behind a program of watershed protection and flood prevention program. It's more than a proposition for each single farm. To use each piece of land within its capability to prevent erosion and to make more water seep into the soil for the good of the whole community means taking the necessary steps all over the watershed. Terracing and contouring. Strip and cover cropping. Improving crop rotations. Building up the soil. Planting trees. Seeding grass on pasture, range, and waterways. Mulching stubble. Installing farm ponds. On top of this, for a complete watershed protection and flood prevention program, land treatment must be supplemented by structures which serve the double purpose of controlling water and holding the soil. Such structures would include small detention reservoirs, drop inlets or other control devices, stilling or debris basins, large diversions, stream bank protection or straightening, and channel improvements such as cleaning, widening, diking, or dredging of channels through the overflow areas. So you see, it involves everyone on the watershed, and we need the help of everyone on the watershed.
Seems like a mighty ambitious program, but if you fellows in town would come in with us, we might be able to swing it. It would benefit your homes and stores as much as our farms.
That's the idea. How about it, Harry?
I'll go along with that, Wally.
The committee got the idea all right that everyone who lived, worked, or owned property on the watershed ought to participate. But it wasn't easy selling the idea to people who couldn't see beyond their own doorsteps. Well, anyway, the farmers began to get together more and more to work things out. And the people in town began to get together, too. As a matter of fact, I started a little plan whereby each city man would take a farmer to dinner to talk things over. Worked pretty well. But I don't know how far we'd have got without the technical guidance of the Soil Conservation Service and help from the county agent in getting our educational plan going. They showed us how to get out of the discussion stage and into action. They helped us understand the need for local leadership in projects like this. They explained how we could apply for help from the government through new legislation, working up a watershed plan and determining its feasibility.
It's pretty comprehensive.
Now, this is a copy of the last law as far as watershed development is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is the best.
Looks like nice, yeah. That's very good. That's concise, and I think will give you pretty much a whole story.
And that's the way we worked it out. Soil Conservation Service made a study of our situation and helped us draw up a plan for the improvements we needed. We found after the job was planned that it wasn't one that local people could complete alone.
It's not the biggest job in the world, but it's a big job that we're going to have to tackle, and we require the cooperation of federal, state, and local organizations to help us out on it.
Before we could expect to get the extra help we needed from the federal government, we found we'd have to get better organized locally. We decided to form a watershed association and eventually a watershed district. The association would arouse the local interest in the formation of a watershed district and then sustain interest in watershed activities. The Watershed District, organized under the provisions of our State Enabling Act, would give us the necessary legal authority to construct, operate, and maintain the needed improvements. The Soil Conservation District became the logical sponsor for the movement, with the joint sponsorship of city council and county officials and other local responsible organizations such as the Drainage District, Irrigation District, the State Extension Service, State Conservation Department, and State Highway Department. We formed a watershed association and got a people's mandate to go ahead. Then we tackled the technical details. The judge of the municipal court assigned an attorney and told us,
in this state it is necessary to file a petition containing 500 valid signatures for the establishment of a watershed district.
yes, sir, I'm sure we'll get them. The petition was easy, but every time we thought we were getting somewhere, something new seemed to block us.
I find you have only 457 valid signatures on this petition.
But, Ray, I thought we were all set.
We only have 10 days to get the rest of these signatures. Let's get busy.
This time we made it. Our Watershed Association office became our Watershed District office. And the lawyer from the municipal court had become so interested in our watershed activities that he was made chairman of the new Watershed District Board. As we completed our work plan, we found we'd be able to raise a major portion of the costs of the work among the farmers, the city people, and the many interests affected locally. Under the terms of the laws, the federal government was able to make up the difference in cost. This way, the total watershed conservation program would be paid for by a working partnership between the people of the community and the state and federal governments on a cost-sharing basis. We had met all the legal and technical requirements of Congress, obtaining from local people easements and rights of way for structures and agreements assuming responsibility for maintenance and for land treatment and use. The State Highway Department was cooperating in the construction of a road they wanted to run across Dam Number 1. The federal government was giving technical, educational, and financial help. But the chief responsibility was ours, right here in the community, because we took the initiative in solving our own problems. Our Watershed Association and our Watershed Project are now actualities. Was it worth the 20-year struggle? Well, if you live between the ridge and the river, figure it out for yourself. How much are these things worth to your community? Less flood damage for everybody, less erosion and loss of soil on the farm, a better water supply for the town, higher farm income, better business, a more prosperous community all around. You know, I like to think it was the example of a few watersheds like ours that resulted in the national legislation we have today. It helps local people to help themselves through aid in investigating, planning, and if necessary, even financing ways to protect their watersheds and make better use of soil and water resources. And it needn't take you as long as it took us to get rid of the menace of the black cloud. Well, does that tell the story, Merle?
Sure does, Wally. But we better get going. Looks like rain.